The blood hit the altar stone at the exact wrong moment. Nadia Moreau knew it the instant it happened. Not because she understood the ritual. Not because anyone had bothered to explain the ancient vampire blood laws to the emergency physician they had dragged into the underground court at 2 in the morning. But because every vampire in the chamber went utterly, devastatingly silent. And then Vladislav Valemont collapsed. He did not stumble. He did not sway. The most powerful vampire lord in Western Europe simply dropped to his knees on the cold obsidian floor like something essential had been severed inside him. His white hair falling forward over his face, his hands pressed flat against the stone, as though the earth itself was the only thing holding him to consciousness. The silver eclipse symbol carved into the altar above him flickered once, a luminous, pulsing light that had been growing for the past 40 minutes and then went dark. Nadia was already moving before anyone else in the room reacted. Do not touch him. The warning came from Sorin, the ancient vampire counselor who stood to the left of the altar, his voice carrying the particular coldness of someone who had watched centuries unfold without feeling much about any of them. Human. Step back. You have no understanding of what is happening. He's in cardiac arrest, Nadia said, and she did not stop moving. Her medical bag was already open. She had brought it out of habit, out of the stubborn professional reflex that never switched off, even when she was standing inside a secret vampire court, beneath the streets of Paris at the explicit invitation of a man who could have crushed every bone in her body without breaking a sweat. Whatever your ritual is, it can wait 30 seconds. The ritual cannot wait at all. Sorin's voice cracked for the first time, and that crack told Nadia everything. The ancient counselor was afraid. If the eclipse closes before the blood seal is completed, he will not simply die. He will be unmade. His entire bloodline will be severed. Every vampire who carries his sire bond will feel it. You do not understand the consequence. Then explain it to me while I stabilize him, Nadia snapped, dropping to her knees beside Vladislav and pressing 2 fingers to the pulse point beneath his jaw. It was there. Faint, erratic. Too slow even for a vampire, which was saying something extraordinary given that vampires' resting hearts beat only 12 to 15 times per minute on average. She had learned that in the 3 months since Vladislav had first appeared in her emergency department, tall, white-haired, pale as winter marble, bleeding from 3 gunshot wounds that should have killed any human twice over, looking at her with eyes, the color of deep amber, and absolutely refusing to let anyone else touch him. She had stitched him together that night with the same focused calm she brought to every patient, and he had watched her the entire time with an expression she could not name. Not gratitude, not fear. Something older than both. He had come back the next morning, healed beyond anything medically possible, placed an envelope containing enough money to cover the hospital's entire pediatric wing renovation on her desk, and said simply, "I owe you a debt, Dr. Moreau. In my world, that is not a thing we allow to go unpaid." She had said, "I don't need your money." He had smiled for the first time, slow and sharp-edged and genuinely amused. That, he had told her, is not what I am offering. 3 months, 3 extraordinary, terrifying, completely inadvisable months of being slowly drawn into the world of Vladislav Valemont. Vladislav, who was 430 years old, who ruled a vampire court that had existed beneath Paris since the 17th century, who moved through the modern city like a king wearing a disguise so thin it barely qualified as an effort. 3 months of late-night conversations in his private library, of him appearing without warning in her hospital corridor at 3 in the morning just to ask whether she had eaten, of arguments about vampire blood law that felt like the most alive Nadia had ever been in any conversation she had ever had with anyone. 3 months of the slow, impossible dawning realization that she was falling in love with something she had been raised to believe did not exist, and now he was dying on an obsidian floor, and the eclipse was closing above them, and Nadia Moreau, emergency physician, empiricist, the most grounded human being she had ever known herself to be, made the decision that would change everything. His pulse steadied slightly under her fingers. Not full arrest, then. Something else. Something the ritual had done to him when it failed. Sorin. She did not look up. What exactly does the eclipse ritual require, specifically, every step? The ancient vampire counselor made a sound she could only describe as aristocratic outrage, which under other circumstances might have been funny. "This is not a matter for human ears, Sorin." Vladislav's voice was barely audible, rough-edged and stripped of its usual commanding resonance, but it stopped the counselor cold. "Answer her." Sorin stared at his lord. Then, with the expression of a man walking directly toward something he considered catastrophic, he answered. The Eclipse ritual, as Sorin explained it with the compressed urgency of someone aware that minutes mattered, was one of the oldest blood laws in vampire history. It predated courts, predated councils, predated the elaborate political structure that governed vampire society in the modern era. During a total solar eclipse, a cosmic event powerful enough to briefly thin the boundary between the mortal world and whatever older, stranger realm vampires drew their immortal power from the lord of a bloodline could renew his sire bond, strengthen it, purify the connection between himself and every vampire who carried his blood, but it required a willing human witness. A human who had, by some act of genuine selfless choice, already given something irreplaceable to the vampire lord. The ritual required that witness to open a vein over the altar and let 3 drops of blood fall at the precise moment the eclipse reached totality. The drops had to fall while the Lord spoke the final words of the ancient sealing vow in Old Wallachian. The human's willingness was what made it work. Not compulsion, not coercion, but genuine, chosen offering. Vladislav had arranged everything. He had prepared for months. He had found the right lunar calendar, secured the underground chamber, gathered his court. He had asked Nadia 3 weeks ago whether she would serve as his witness, and she had agreed. Because by that point she would have agreed to almost anything he asked of her, and she was still pretending to herself that this was a normal professional relationship. What no one had accounted for was the interference. Sorin's voice tightened as he reached this part. 2 members of Vladislav's own court, Razvan and his older sister Elisa, both of them ancient vampires who had chafed under Vladislav's authority for decades, had sabotaged the ritual. Not dramatically, not obviously, but with the precise and patient malice of people who had been planning it for a long time. They had laced the altar stone with a compound that disrupted the blood seal at the critical moment. The 3 drops had fallen. The vow had been partially spoken. But the seal had not completed. Instead, the ritual energy had inverted, backlashing into Vladislav, and was now eating through his sire bond from the inside. Without completion, he would not die quickly, he would diminish, slowly, agonizingly, over the course of the next 12 to 14 hours. As the eclipse's window of power faded, his connection to his bloodline would dissolve. Every vampire who carried his sire bond would feel it. Some of them would survive the severance, some would not. And Vladislav himself, stripped of the ancient power that had sustained him across 4 centuries, would likely not survive the week. Nadia listened to all of this. Her hands were still on Vladislav, monitoring his pulse, watching the shallow rise and fall of his chest. When Sorin finished, the chamber was silent. "So the ritual needs to be completed," she said. The 3 drops were given. The vow was partially spoken. What remains? The vow must be spoken in full, and the altar must be cleansed of Razvan's compound before the blood seal can anchor. But the compound reacts to vampire blood. It is specifically designed to corrupt the sire bond. It cannot be cleansed by anyone within the bloodline. Sorin's voice was flat with the particular flatness of someone delivering a sentence. It must be cleansed by the witness's blood, not drops. A full palm press to the altar stone, sustained contact. It would require perhaps a minute of direct application. In a human, that level of blood loss through sustained contact with the activated compound. He stopped. Would be dangerous, Nadia said. Would be potentially fatal, Sorin said. The compound draws. It does not simply take what is offered. It pulls. Nadia looked at Vladislav. He had managed to lift his head. His amber eyes found her face with the focused intensity she had come to recognize as his particular form of absolute attention. The way he looked at her when something mattered to him more than he knew how to say. "No," he said. The single word carried everything he had left of his authority and every edge of his pride. "We will find another way." "In how long?" Nadia asked. His jaw tightened. "Nadia, the eclipse closes in 11 minutes, Sorin said quietly. "After that, the ritual window is gone. The energy that could complete the seal will disperse. Lord Vladislav's condition will begin to deteriorate immediately. Nadia looked at the altar. Then she looked at the man she loved, and she was done pretending she did not love him. Because a woman did not follow a vampire lord into an underground court at 2 in the morning, for reasons that had anything to do with professionalism or curiosity or debt. She loved Vladislav Valemont. She loved his extraordinary mind and his infuriating pride, and the way he had never once treated her like anything other than his full equal, despite being 400 years old and capable of things that defied the entire scientific framework she had built her life around. She loved him, and he was going to die, and there was something she could do about it. "How much blood?" she said. "Nadia." His voice cracked on her name. It was the first time she had ever heard it crack. "I am a doctor," she said, and she was surprised by how calm she sounded. "I know exactly how much blood a human body can lose before it becomes critical." "Tell me the measurement, Sorin. Be specific." Sorin looked at Vladislav. Vladislav was looking at Nadia with an expression that was equal parts terror and something so raw and exposed that she had to keep her eyes on the altar just to think clearly. "Approximately 150 to 200 milliliters," Sorin said. "Sustained over 60 seconds of altar contact. That is well within survival parameters for a healthy adult with no underlying conditions," Nadia said. "As long as immediate medical support is available afterward. I have saline in my bag. Someone in this court must have blood supply." "We have reserves," Sorin said quickly. "Compaptin type. We keep them for..." He stopped himself, apparently deciding this was not the moment to explain why a vampire court maintained human blood supplies. "Yes, we have what would be needed. Then it is survivable," Nadia said. "Nadia." Vladislav's hand closed around her wrist. His grip was still strong, even now, even diminished as he was. She felt the familiar warmth of it. She had always found it slightly surprising that vampires ran warm when they were well, and she turned to look at him directly. "I will not allow this. You don't get a vote," she said gently. "I am the lord of this court, and I have 4 centuries of authority behind me. And you're also the man who told me 3 weeks ago that you had never in 400 years met anyone who made him feel like the world was worth staying in," Nadia said. "So you are going to stay in it. You're going to let me do this. And when it's over, you are going to tell me, without your pride getting in the way for once, that you love me. Because I know you do. And I am very tired of waiting for you to say it." The chamber held its breath. Vladislav stared at her. Something moved across his face. Something she had seen glimpses of before in unguarded moments, in the late-night hours when his careful aristocratic composure thinned just slightly around the edges, something enormous and old and entirely real. 9 minutes, Sorin said softly. Nadia stood. She pressed her hand to Vladislav's face for one brief moment, feeling the sharp angle of his cheekbone under her palm, watching his eyes close at the contact. Then she turned to the altar. "Tell me exactly where to press," she said. The altar carved obsidian, roughly 1.5 meters long, etched with symbols she did not have the background to read. The central eclipse carving had gone dark when the ritual failed. Sorin directed her to the lower quadrant, where the blood seal would need to anchor. He produced a ceremonial blade, small, ancient-looking, handled in bone, and offered it to her with the expression of a man who was actively revising his opinion of humans in real time. She took it. She had sutured patience through her own shaking hands before. She could do this. Vladislav. She did not look back at him. "When Sorin tells you the altar is clean, speak the rest of the vow. Can you remember the words?" "I have spoken them in rehearsal 50 times, he said from somewhere directly behind her. He had moved. Of course he had moved. He was directly at her back, close enough that she could feel the cool shift of air his presence carried, and she realized he was positioning himself to catch her if she fell. The thought made her heart do something entirely inconvenient. "Good," she said. "Then let's finish what you started." She pressed her palm to the obsidian. The compound activated instantly. She felt it not as pain exactly, not at first, but as a pulling sensation, deep and insistent, like standing on wet sand as a wave receded and feeling the earth try to take your feet with it. The altar seemed to drink. Her blood welled up against the stone and the carved symbols began to illuminate in reverse, a slow, dark to silver progression that Sorin was watching with an expression of concentrated professional attention. The pain arrived at about the 15-second mark. She breathed through it the way she breathed through everything that needed to be endured. Steadily, with the deliberate mechanical calm of a woman who had chosen this and was not going to choose otherwise. "It's working," Sorin said. "Hold contact. 30 more seconds." Behind her, she heard Vladislav make a sound that was not quite language. She heard him move, and then she felt his hands settle on her shoulders, not restraining, not pulling her away, just present, just there. His hands on her shoulders, steady and fierce, as though he was trying to pour his own strength into her through the contact. "I am here," he said quietly. "I have you." She pressed harder against the altar. The silver light was spreading now, washing back through the carved eclipse symbol like dawn coming in through a window, and she could feel the compound weakening under her palm, its hungry pull growing more desperate, even as it grew less effective. And somewhere in the distance she heard the gathered vampires of Vladislav's court beginning to make sounds, not words, but something tonal and ancient, a resonance that moved through the stone floor and up through her knees and into her chest. "Now," Sorin said. "Lord Vladislav, the vow, now." And Vladislav spoke. She did not understand the words. Old Wallachian was nothing like anything she had studied, and the ritual language was even further from any modern cognate than the spoken form. But she felt them. The words moved through the air of the chamber with a weight that language should not have been able to carry, and she felt the altar respond under her hand, not with more pulling, but with something different, something like recognition. The silver light blazed upward through the eclipse carving with a sound like a single clear note struck on the world's largest bell, and then the pull released. Nadia's knees went. Vladislav had her before she hit the floor. He caught her with both arms, pulling her back against him, and he was not gentle about it. He was desperate about it, holding her with a controlled ferocity that made every previous evidence of his strength feel like an understatement. She felt his hands moving over her, checking, assessing, and she would have laughed at the role reversal if she had the energy for it. "Saline," she said, or tried to say. "Left pocket of the bag." "I have it," said a voice she did not recognize. And then someone competent was working on her hand, and she let herself focus entirely on the simple logistical task of staying conscious, because she was a physician, and she knew exactly what her body needed in the next 3 minutes, and she intended to provide it. Vladislav did not put her down. He was sitting on the floor of the obsidian chamber, which she suspected was the first time in a very long time that Vladislav Valemont had sat on a floor. And he was holding her against his chest with one arm, while whoever had the saline worked on her other hand, and his chin was resting on the top of her head. And she could feel his heartbeat against her back, stronger now than it had been when she found him collapsed. Stronger and steadier and deeply, unmistakably real. The eclipse carving above the altar was blazing silver white, every line of it alive and brilliant and complete. It held, Sorin said, and for the first time since she had entered this court, the ancient counselor's voice contained something that might have been feeling. "The seal is complete, the bond is renewed," he paused, "all of it, every thread." A sound moved through the assembled court, relief, she thought, and awe, and something that she could only interpret as reverence, directed at the altar, at their lord, and she was almost sure of this, partly at her. "Razvan," Vladislav said, and his voice had come fully back, all its resonant authority restored, layered now with something colder and more final than anything she had heard from him before. "And Elisa?" "They are in custody," Sorin said. "They have been since the moment we identified the compound." "Good." A pause. "We will address them properly. After. The word hung in the air of the chamber with a specific weight. After Nadia was stable. After. He was sure she was all right. Everything else, the betrayal, the ancient blood law consequences, the political fallout, waited until after. She thought that might be the most powerful thing she had ever watched him do. It took another 20 minutes before she felt steady enough to argue with him about whether she needed to be moved. He won the argument, which she allowed, because her blood pressure was doing something she preferred not to dwell on, and because she was, against every expectation, very comfortable where she was, and she was carried to a private chamber adjacent to the court, laid on a bed that cost more than her monthly rent, and attended by 2 vampires who turned out to have medical training from the 16th and 18th centuries, respectively, which was either reassuring or alarming depending on how you chose to interpret the span. Vladislav did not leave her side. He sat in a chair pulled directly beside the bed, still in his ritual clothes, whilst dark, formal, archaic in cut and material. Everything about him a reminder of what he actually was. And he watched her with the amber eyes that had watched her work on his gunshot wounds in the emergency department 3 months ago. Except that now there was nothing guarded in them at all. The careful aristocratic remove she had spent 3 months trying to see past was simply gone. "You should rest," she told him. "The ritual took something out of you." "The ritual is complete," he said. "I am fine. Your pulse was at 8 beats per minute 20 minutes ago." For context, the clinical lower limit of bradycardia in humans is, Nadia, 60 beats per minute, which means even adjusted for vampire physiology, you were significantly Nadia. His voice was very quiet. He reached out and took her undamaged hand. His grip was careful this time, precise, the same way she had been careful with his wounds. "You almost died. I calculated the blood loss parameters before You almost died," he said again, and there was something in the repetition that was not about the medical specifics at all. She looked at him. She let herself look at him fully, in the way she had been rationing ever since she understood that she had feelings for him. Carefully, in small increments, afraid of what she would see in her own face if she let herself look too long. Vladislav Valemont, 430 years old, ruler of an ancient court, one of the most powerful beings in Europe, sitting in a chair beside her bed, at 3 in the morning, with his white hair loose around his face and his eyes doing something that 4 centuries of practiced composure had apparently not taught him how to hide. "You told me," she said, "that in your world a debt is not something you allow to go unpaid." "Yes," he said, "you stitched yourself to my life over the last 3 months because of that framework. Conversations, appearances at the hospital, the library, the introductions to your court. All of it framed as repaying a debt." "Yes," he said again, but something shifted in his expression. Was any of it actually about the debt? He looked at her for a long moment. The silver light from the altar chamber had faded to a low ambient glow that reached even this room, and it caught the planes of his face in a way that made him look exactly like what he was. Ancient, extraordinary, beautiful in the specific way that things which have survived centuries tend to be beautiful, marked by time without being diminished by it. "No," he said. "Not after the first night. When did you know?" He exhaled slowly. A human habit he had developed over centuries. She had learned, not because he needed to breathe in the same way she did, but because it helped him pace his words when his words mattered. "When you argued with me about the vampire blood laws," he said, "the 3rd time we met, you had read the historical record I gave you, and you had 3 pages of annotated questions about the logical inconsistencies in the clan hierarchy structure, and you were not frightened of me at all, and you were entirely right about the inconsistencies, and I realized I had not felt." He stopped, recalibrated. "I had not felt genuinely engaged by another mind in longer than I can easily calculate." "That's intellectually flattering," she said. "I am not finished." His thumb moved across her knuckles. "I realized I was constructing reasons to see you. The debt framework was convenient. It gave me a structure that required nothing I was not certain I could offer." He looked down at their joined hands. "I am 400 years old, Nadia. I have outlived everything. I have made peace with most of it. But the prospect of another pause. I had decided some time ago that certain things were no longer for me. That the cost was too high. That watching something that mattered diminish was something I was no longer willing to do." "You mean watching someone you loved age," she said, directly, because she was Nadia Moreau and she had never learned to approach important things sideways. "Yes. And then I pressed my hand to a cursed altar to save your life, and you revised your position." The corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile, but the architecture of one. "Something like that. You were going to let yourself die," she said, and now her voice lost some of its steadiness. Because this was the thing she had been not thinking about since she pressed her palm to the stone. The thing that lived underneath all the medical calculations and the professional calm. "You were going to let the ritual fail rather than put me at risk, even though completing it would have saved your entire bloodline." "Yes," he said simply. "Vladislav, That is exactly what you would have done, he said. In any equivalent position, do not tell me I am wrong. She closed her mouth. He was not wrong. We are apparently, he said very quietly, extraordinarily similar in our most inconvenient habits. She laughed. It surprised her, genuine. Helpless, released from somewhere, under all the adrenaline and the fear and the blood loss. She laughed, and she watched Vladislav watch off her laugh with the expression of someone receiving something they had believed was no longer available to them. I love you, she said when she could speak again. I told you you'd have to say it first, but you're taking too long. So, I am saying it, and now you have to say it too, because apparently we've established that neither of us lets debts go unpaid. He lifted her hand and pressed his lips to her knuckles. Not a performative gesture, not the courtly affectation it might have looked like from the outside, but something deliberate and complete, a full stop at the end of a sentence that had been running for 3 months. I love you, he said against her hand. I have loved you since the 3rd meeting, and I have been managing it very poorly ever since. You have been managing it by appearing at my hospital at 3 in the morning to ask if I have eaten. That is not poor management. That is surveillance with plausible deniability. She laughed again. And he moved from the chair to sit at the edge of the bed, and she made room for him without being asked. And he settled beside her with the careful deliberateness of someone who was not taking any of this for granted. And she leaned against him, and felt his arm come around her, and thought that this was the most improbable and the most inevitable thing that had ever happened to her. They stayed like that while the underground court of Paris moved through the aftermath of the Eclipse ritual, while Sorin organized the formal proceedings against Razvan and Elisa, while the bonded vampires of Vladislav's bloodline reported in from across the city and the continent, with the renewed clarity of the sire bond restored to full strength, while the silver light in the altar chamber slowly dimmed toward the ordinary dark. She slept for a while. She was not sure when it happened. Only that she woke to grey morning light finding its way in through some architectural feature she had not noticed, and Vladislav was still there, awake, watching over her with the particular focused patience of someone for whom waiting was not a hardship because time worked differently for him. You didn't sleep, she said. I do not require sleep the way you do. That's going to be a logistical complication in the long term. He looked at her. The long term, he repeated, as though weighing the words for hidden meaning. You are 400 years old, she said. I want to be clear that I am not interested in a short-term arrangement. His expression did something she had never quite seen it do before, opened in some fundamental structural way, like a room she had been looking at through a keyhole suddenly having its door swung wide. There are ways, he said carefully, to address the asymmetry of our timelines. I am not raising this as an immediate suggestion, but it is not. He paused. It is not outside range of things the court encompasses. She knew what he was not quite saying. The vampire world's relationship with transformation was complicated, governed by the same blood laws that governed everything else, requiring genuine willingness, deeply consequential in ways that could not be undone, and not something anyone discussed casually. She had read about it in the historical records he had shared with her. She had not let herself think about it directly until now. Not yet, she said, not immediately, but I want to know everything. All of it, the laws, the conditions, the considerations. I want to make an informed choice when the time comes. You will have every piece of information I have, he said, and the gravity in his voice told her he understood what she was actually saying, which was not no, and was not yes, but was I am choosing to plan a future with you. Good, she said. She sat up carefully, testing her hand. The wound was clean and well dressed and aching only moderately, which was better than she had expected. Now, tell me what happens to Razvan and Elisa. The conversation that followed was the most education she had received in a single sitting about the internal mechanics of vampire blood law. Vladislav was thorough, clinical in his own way, and deeply, clearly furious in the contained manner she was coming to recognize as his most dangerous registrar. Calm voice, precise language, absolutely no warmth. Razvan and Elisa had violated 3 separate blood laws in their sabotage of the ritual. The deliberate disruption of an Eclipse seal was treated under the ancient code as an attack on the entire bloodline. Not merely on the Lord, but on every vampire who carried the sire bond. The penalty under blood law was the permanent severance of their bond to the line, followed by exile. It was, Vladislav explained, the equivalent of something worse than death in the vampire world, because it stripped away the ancient connection that gave their long existence its continuity and meaning. There had been, he told her, a time in his life when he would have imposed something harsher. Four centuries provided extensive opportunity to develop a capacity for severity, but there were witnesses to the proceedings, including 3 vampires from allied courts who had arrived for the ritual and remained for its aftermath, and the public record would show the full application of blood law, no more and no less. "Do you want more?" she asked. He looked at her with those amber eyes, level and honest in the way he had learned to be with her. "There is a part of me that would like a great deal more," he said. "They risked you. Whatever they intended against me, that is the nature of court politics, and I have survived it for 4 centuries. But they put you at risk, a human witness, who had no standing in blood law and no protection under it, and who was present only because I asked her to be." "I had standing," Nadia said. "The ritual required my willing presence. That counts for something even under your laws." "It does," he said. "Now, because the seal completed, if it had not," his jaw tightened, "the protections would not have applied." "Then the seal completing is the best possible outcome on every level," she said pragmatically. "Which means we should not waste any more emotional energy on what might have been, because the answer to what might have been is, not this, not us, not last night, and I refuse to regret last night." He was quiet for a moment. Then he reached out and tucked a strand of her dark hair behind her ear, with the careful deliberateness of someone who had been wanting to do that for a while, and was choosing to stop not doing it. "Blood law will hold," he said. "Exile and severance. It is sufficient, and it will be known, across every court that matters, what they did and what the consequence was." "Good," she said. "Now, I need coffee. Does your court have coffee?" The look he gave her was so precisely Vladislav, caught between ancient dignity and genuine fond exasperation, that she nearly kissed him right there, which she was increasingly realizing was going to be a recurring impulse she had no intention of suppressing. "This court," he said, "has had coffee since 1725. Of course it has," she said. They left the private chamber together, and she felt the shift in the underground court as they moved through it. Felt the quality of attention that followed Vladislav, like a tide naturally redirecting toward them both. The gathered vampires of his bloodline looked at her differently than they had when she arrived. Not with the polite, cautious tolerance that had characterized most of her earlier interactions with the court. With something that sat closer to respect and, in some cases, she thought, with something approaching warmth. Sorin met them at the entrance to the main hall. The ancient counselor looked, if she was reading him correctly, like a man who had recently been required to dramatically and expand his understanding of human beings, and was still in the process of integrating the experience. "The allied witnesses request an audience with Lord Vladislav before their departure," Sorin said. Then, with a visible effort that she suspected was quite large, "They have also asked to be introduced to the ritual witness. By name." Nadia glanced at Vladislav. "You are under no obligation," he said immediately. Protective, as always, but offering her the choice. "Who are they?" she asked. "Lord Dratsimir of the Eastern Accord," Sorin said. "Lady Velisassa of the Meridian Covenant, and the Elder Korvath, who has not attended an eclipse ritual in 160 years, and who, I believe, has not left his court in approximately the same duration." "They came for your ritual specifically," Nadia said to Vladislav. "The renewal of the Valemont seal was an event of some significance in the vampire world," he said, carefully understated. "And they stayed after it failed." "They stayed," Sorin said, "because they were watching when the witness pressed her palm to the altar." A beat of silence. "The Elder Korvath," Vladislav said, "has not spoken favorably of humans since the 16th century. He was present for certain events during that period which shaped his perspective significantly." "And now?" Nadia asked. "He wishes to be introduced to you by name," Sorin said, with the specific flatness of someone delivering information that astonishes them. Nadia looked at Vladislav. He was looking back at her with an expression that she was cataloguing for future reference. Pride, she thought. Not the cool aristocratic pride that was his default register, but something warmer, something personal. "All right," she said. Let's go meet them. The audience chamber was a different space than the ritual room, larger, older-looking, lined with artifacts she would have needed a history of vampire civilization to properly contextualize. The three visitors were already there when she and Vladislav entered, and she took them in with the same focused attention she brought to any new situation. Lord Drasimir was older-looking than Vladislav in the way that very old vampires sometimes presented. Not aged in any human sense, but weighted, as though centuries had compressed into his bones and made him somehow denser than the air around him. White hair, like all of them, sharp angled features, dark eyes that moved to Nadia immediately and stayed there with an assessing quality she found she could hold without flinching. Lady Velisara was a surprise, young-looking enough that Nadia instinctively revised her first estimate before remembering that vampire apparent age bore no meaningful relationship to actual age. Dark silver-toned skin, white hair braided back with something woven into it that caught the light, and an expression of such direct, frank curiosity that Nadia felt an unexpected pulse of liking for her. And the elder Korvath. He looked, there was no other word for it, ancient, not frail. Ancient. The way the oldest mountains look ancient, with a solidity that has simply been there long enough that it stops being remarkable and becomes a feature of the landscape. He was looking at Nadia with an expression she could not immediately read. Vladislav made the introductions with the formal precision of someone for whom court protocol was as natural as breathing. When he said Nadia's name and her title, the three visitors each responded in ways that told her something. Drasimir inclined his head with a deliberateness that suggested it cost him something. And in a vampire lord of his apparent age and standing, she understood that as meaningful. Velisara smiled, quick, genuine, completely unguarded, and said, in accented but clear French, "You are very interesting, Dr. Moreau. I had hoped to meet you." Korvath said nothing for a long moment, then, in a voice that carried centuries as effortlessly as stone carries weight, "You pressed your hand to an active compound altar for a vampire who had no blood law claim on you in service of a bloodline that is not your own. I watched it." "Yes," Nadia said. "Why?" he asked. She met his ancient eyes directly. "Because I love him," she said, "and because the alternative was watching him die when I had the means to prevent it. Those are, in the end, the same reason." Korvath was quiet for another long moment. "In the 16th century," he said at last, "I knew a human woman who argued with me for 3 days about the legitimacy of the blood law prohibition against human witnesses in sealed court proceedings. She was wrong about most of it, but she was interesting." A pause so long she thought he had finished. "You remind me of her. Is that a compliment?" she asked. "It is the closest I have come to one in approximately 40 years, he said, and the trace of something dry and ancient moved through his voice that she suspected was humor. The meeting lasted an hour and a half. By the time it concluded, she had been invited to the Eastern Accord's historical archives by Drasimir, offered an open standing invitation to Velisara's court with a genuineness that felt social rather than political, and been asked by Korvath, with a bluntness that bypassed all court formality, whether she intended to remain in Vladislav's life on a permanent basis. "That," she had said, "is between me and Lord Vladislav." "Yes," Korvath said, "but the courts will want to know. There are implications to a sustained human alliance with the Valemont bloodline, particularly following an Eclipse seal in which the human witness demonstrated the kind of—" He paused, selecting words. "The kind of commitment you demonstrated. Protocols exist. If you intend permanence, it would be useful to understand them. Then I will learn them," she said. He had looked at her for a moment, then at Vladislav, then back at her. "Lord Vladislav," he said, "you have done something I did not expect anyone to do again in my lifetime." "What is that?" Vladislav asked. "Found someone worth the complication," Korvath said, and turned and walked toward the door, with the slow inevitability of a glare, leaving Velisara making a barely suppressed expression of delight behind him, and Drasimir with something that might have been a smile at the very edges of his ancient face. The weeks that followed were not simple. Nothing in this life was simple, and Nadia had stopped expecting it to be somewhere around the second week of knowing Vladislav, when she had realized that simple was never going to be on the table, and had decided she preferred interesting anyway. The formal proceedings against Razvan and Elisa took 10 days of blood law adjudication. Vladislav conducted them with the cold precision of someone who had been governing a court for centuries, and understood exactly how much authority he was required to be seen using, and how much he was choosing to exercise. The sentence stood as he had described: exile and severance. She attended the final session as his acknowledged ally, which was a status that apparently carried specific legal weight under blood law, and she sat through 3 hours of archaic procedural language and political maneuvering with the same focus she brought to difficult diagnostic consultations, and when it was over, Vladislav walked her out of the court chamber and through the underground corridors and said, almost lightly, "You looked bored." "I was translating the procedural language in real time," she said. "It was actually fascinating." "Can I have a copy of the blood law compendium?" He stopped walking and looked at her. "What?" she said. "The blood law compendium," he said carefully, "has not been shared with a human outside of treaty negotiations in over 200 years. "That seems like an oversight," she said. "If I am going to be permanently entangled with your court, it would be more efficient for everyone if I understood the full legal framework I'm operating in." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "I will have Soren prepare you a copy, with annotations for historical context." "Thank you," she said. The hospital was another adjustment. Not because she stopped working. She had absolutely no intention of stopping work, and Vladislav had made no suggestion that she should, which was one of the many reasons she loved him. But because her understanding of certain things had shifted in ways that made ordinary emergency department work feel simultaneously more and less strange than it had before. She knew more now. She knew what certain injuries meant that she had not known before. She knew which cases to look at twice, which presentations warranted the kind of careful second assessment that had no medical textbook behind it. She knew, because Vladislav had taught her, that the vampire world and the human world overlapped at more points than most people on either side fully acknowledged, and that the overlap created situations that occasionally appeared in emergency departments and got filed under unusual presentations. She also knew that Vladislav still appeared in her hospital corridor at 3 in the morning sometimes, but now he had the honest reason. He simply wanted to see her. He said so directly, which was apparently what love did even to 400-year-old vampire lords. It stripped the architecture of plausible deniability and left the actual thing standing in a hospital corridor at 3 in the morning, saying, in so many words, "I was thinking about you and I wanted to be in the same room." "You know," she told him one night, in her office, with bad hospital coffee between them and the muffled sounds of the emergency department moving around them, "for someone who spent 3 months being very careful about what he was willing to say to me, you have become remarkably unguarded. I have been waiting 4 centuries for someone I did not have to be guarded with," he said. "I appear to be making up for lost time." 400 years is a lot of lost time, she agreed. Yes, he looked at her over the coffee cup. "I intend to be thorough about the recovery." She had kissed him then, in her office. With the bad hospital coffee, and the fluorescent lights, and the sounds of the emergency department all around them, and he had kissed her back with the focused, deliberate attentiveness he brought to everything that mattered to him. And it was, exactly, precisely, completely, what she had wanted. The question of the future was not one they avoided. They had both agreed, in the weeks after the Eclipse ritual, that avoidance was not something either of them did well or wanted to practice, and so they discussed it with the same directness they brought to everything else. Sitting in his library, usually, late at night, with the kind of conversation that would have struck most people as either terrifying or extraordinary. The possibility of transformation was on the table. She had read everything he had given her. She understood the blood laws governing it, that it required absolute willingness, that the sire who turned a human bore a permanent bond of responsibility toward them, that it was irreversible and consequential, and not something approached lightly in any era. She understood that Vladislav would not raise it as a recommendation, that he would support whatever she chose, that he was entirely genuine in this, even though she knew that the prospect of watching her age and die in what was, from his perspective, A remarkably short span of time was something that lived in him as a constant low register of dread. "Tell me what it would mean for you," she said one night, honestly. "If I chose not to." He was quiet for a long time. The library around them smelled of old paper and beeswax candles, and something subtly, indefinably Vladislav, which she had come to find the most comfortable smell in the world. "I would love you for as long as I had you," he said, "and I would carry it after." "How do you carry it?" "Imperfectly," he said. "But I have had considerable practice at that particular skill." She looked at him. "I want more time," she said. "Not yet, but more time than I have. More time with you specifically, which is a feeling I did not expect to have about any particular person, and which I am taking seriously." "I know," he said. "I want to know everything about it before I decide, and I want the decision to be mine, made from full information, when I feel ready." "Yes," he said, "it will be, and in the meantime," she said, "I want exactly this. The library and the late nights and the blood law debates and the hospital corridor appearances at 3 in the morning. I want all of it." "Then you have it," he said. "All of it." The actual evening she remembered most clearly from that period was not a dramatic one. It was a Thursday in November, 3 months after the eclipse, when she had finished a 12-hour shift and come to the court because she was too tired to go home, and the court had become, without her particularly decising it had, a second home. She had fallen asleep in the library on one of the older couches, which were extremely comfortable in the specific way of things that had been absorbing centuries of use, and she woke some hours later with a blanket over her that had not been there when she fell asleep, and Vladislav sitting in the armchair across from her, reading, one lamp lit against the dark. He looked up when she stirred. "What time is it?" she asked. "Nearly 4, he said. "I have a shift at 8. "I know," he said. "I will make sure you are awake in time." She looked at him in the lamplight. White hair and amber eyes and 400 years of life, worn as naturally as his own skin, and the expression on his face in this unguarded moment that she was still, even now, cataloguing, because each version of it was slightly different and she intended to learn all of them. "Vladislav," she said. "Yes, I am going to stay," she said. "Not about the shift. Not about the couch." He heard exactly what she meant. His expression did the opening thing again, the door swung wide thing. "I know," he said, very quietly. "Good," she said, and pulled the blanket up and closed her eyes again, and felt the absolute, specific, irreplaceable peace of being exactly where she wanted to be. Spring came before the question came to a head. Nadia had spent the winter learning the blood law compendium, the history of the Valemont court, the political geography of vampire alliances across Europe, the ancient language she had decided to teach herself, because reading the original texts in translation felt like reading music with the notations stripped out. Vladislav had watched her study with an expression that was part wonder and part the particular kind of helpless fondness that no amount of aristocratic dignity could entirely conceal. She had also spent the winter being slowly, carefully integrated into the life of the court in ways that went beyond her acknowledgedly status. Not because Vladislav pushed it. He was scrupulously fatalist, let her set the pace at everything, but because the court itself had begun to respond to her in ways that changed the environment. She had opinions about court decisions that she shared when asked, and sometimes when not asked, and they were good opinions, because she brought a perspective that four centuries of internal vampire politics had stopped being able to generate, and gradually the court's relationship with her shifted from cautious tolerance to something that felt, in its vampire way, like genuine welcome. Senrin, who had been the most skeptical, was also the most dramatically revised. She discovered this on the afternoon he appeared at the entrance to the library and said, without preamble, "There is a political situation in the Eastern Accord that will require Lord Vladislav's attention within the month. I believe your analysis of the situation would be useful before he responds formally." "My analysis," she said. "You have read the historical record of the Accord's internal structure," Sorin said, "and you see patterns that those of us inside the vampire political framework have difficult seeing because we have been inside it too long." She stared at him. "Sorin, did you just describe yourself as having a blind spot?" The ancient counselor's expression moved through several positions rapidly. "I described the collective of long-lived vampires as having a potential blind spot." The distinction is meaningful. Of course, she said, biting down on the smile. I will take a look at the situation. She did. She spent 4 hours with the documents Sorin provided and wrote 3 pages of analysis that she gave to Vladislav that evening. He read it while she watched, and when he finished, he looked up with an expression that mixed professional respect and personal pride in such equal measure that she nearly found it overwhelming. You are extraordinary, he said. The analysis is straightforward once you stop thinking about it from inside the framework, she said. That, he said, is precisely what makes it extraordinary. He used her analysis. The political situation in the Eastern Accord resolved within the following month in a way that strengthened rather than strained the alliance between the two courts, and Drasimir sent Vladislav a formal communication afterward that contained, toward the end, a single sentence about the value of perspectives outside the traditional political inheritance. Vladislav read that sentence aloud to Nadia, with a satisfaction that was entirely genuine and not remotely subtle. The night she made her decision was in late spring, almost exactly 6 months after the eclipse. They were in the library, as they often were, and she had been looking at the old Wallachian texts for an hour, and thinking, not about the texts, but about time, about the particular shape of the future she wanted, about what she was willing to do and what she was not willing to do without. She put the book down. Vladislav, she said. He looked up from whatever correspondence he was reading. He read her face as he had learned to do. He was extraordinarily good at reading her face now, better than anyone she had ever known, with the focused attention of someone for whom paying attention was not a choice but an orientation. Tell me, he said. I've been thinking about the decision, she said. The one we've been not quite discussing for 6 months. Yes, he said, putting his correspondence down. I want to be clear that this is not a response to any external pressure, she said. Not the court, not the political situation, not anything about the Allied courts or their expectations. This is mine. I know, he said. Go on, I am 34 years old, she said. I have approximately 50 good working years ahead of me if I am lucky. 50 years in which I would have you, and then whatever comes after. And when I imagine whatever comes after, not from your perspective, because I understand that's the harder side of it, but from mine, when I imagine simply not being here, not being able to read these texts, not being able to have these conversations, not being with you. She stopped. I am not afraid of the ritual. I was not afraid of pressing my hand to the altar. I am not a person who is particularly frightened by the prospect of transformation when I have fully understood what it means, and I understand what it means. Yes, he said. You do. I want more time, she said. I have decided that I want more time. Not because someone told me to want it, and not because I can't face the alternative, but because the life I have in front of me right now, with you and this court and the work I'm doing and the things I'm learning, I want more of it. I want centuries of it. Vladislav was very still. Are you certain? He asked, and his voice was carrying everything, all 400 years of it, every weight and every hope. I would like to sleep on it for another 2 weeks, she said, because I believe in thorough decision-making. But yes, fundamentally, structurally, in every way that matters to me, yes, I am certain. He crossed the library to her in a movement that was very fast and very contained, and he took her face in both his hands and looked at her with those amber eyes open, all the way, no guard at all, nothing between her and whatever 4 centuries had made him. 2 weeks, he said. 2 weeks, she confirmed, and then he asked. And then, she said, we will have considerably more time to work with. He kissed her, not the careful, deliberate kiddies of the early months, when he was still managing his own intensity, with the caution of someone who understood how much force he was capable of in every sense. This was something fuller. Something that had been waiting 6 months to be this complete. She kissed him back with everything she had, which was considerable. And the library held them in its lamplight and its centuries of accumulated knowledge and the particular silence of a place that had seen a great deal of history, and was currently, quietly, witnessing some more. The 2 weeks passed. She did not change her mind. She examined the decision from every angle she could construct, consulted every piece of documented knowledge she had access to, had 3 extensive conversations with Vladislav about the specifics and the consequences and the irreversibility, and at the end of all of it, arrived at the same answer she had given him in the library. The ritual was nothing like the Eclipse ritual. It was older than that, quieter than that. No assembled court, no cosmic alignment, no political stakes. Just the two of them, in his private chambers, in the early hours of the morning, with Vladislav explaining every step before it happened, and checking, more than once, that she was still choosing. She was still choosing. It took until dawn. She had known from the documented accounts that the transition period was not instantaneous, and she was ready for it, and Vladislav held her through all of it with the same focused, fierce presence he had brought to the altar chamber. Entirely there, entirely attentive, managing his own emotions with a control she now understood cost him more than it looked like. She woke, which was not quite the right word, but was the closest human concept to what happened. With the particular clarity of someone whose perceptual processing has been permanently upgraded by several hundred orders of magnitude, and her first coherent thought was that the library, 3 zooms away, contained texts she now had the time to read every word of. And her second coherent thought was Vladislav, who was right there, watching her with those amber eyes, and she reached for his hand and held it. "Hello," she said. "Hello," he said, and the word carried everything that it could possibly carry from a man of 400 years who had just been given something he had stopped believing he was allowed to want. "I can hear your heartbeat," she said, marveling. "It is very slow." "Yes," he said, "and I can hear yours. Is it strange?" No," he said. "It sounds like something I have been listening for." She sat up. The room was different. Not changed, but perceived differently, with a depth and resolution that was going to take time to calibrate and map. "I have questions," she said, "about the new physical parameters. The sunlight limitations specifically. The historical documentation suggests a gradient rather than a binary sensitivity, which I would like to confirm." "Nadia," he said. "Yes?" "You have been transformed for approximately 4 minutes," he said. "The questions can wait." "I am a physician," she said. "The clinical instinct does not switch off." He laughed. The sound of it, in the new way she was hearing, was extraordinary, full and warm and layered in ways she would have missed before. "No," he said, "I do not suppose it does." "Also," she said, "I love you." "I love you," he said, immediately, without hesitation, with the ease of someone who has been practicing a thing for 6 months and has fully mastered it. "Good," she said. "Now, the sunlight gradient. I have 3 questions." He settled beside her on the bed, his arm around her, and answered all 3 questions with the thoroughness and patience of a man who is entirely, completely, happily committed to the very specific kind of chaos he has chosen. The seasons turned. Nadia did not stop working at the hospital. She adapted her schedule, adjusted her shifts, made the necessary accommodations, and continued to do the work she loved with the capabilities she now possessed, which included a set of perceptual and physical advantages that made the already excellent physician substantially more effective in certain critical respects. Vladislav never suggested otherwise. He understood exactly who she was, and he loved her for it, and the court had learned by now that attempting to suggest to Dr. Nadia Moreau that she might consider slowing down was an exercise with a very predictable outcome. The court itself had changed. Not dramatically. Courts did not change dramatically. They shifted over long periods with the patient inevitability of geological formations, but meaningfully. The integration of a perspective like Nadia's into the long-established rhythms of vampire governance had created changes in how the court approached the world beyond its walls, changes that other courts noticed and occasionally commented on, some with curiosity and some with calculation, and some, like Velisara, with straightforward delight. Sorin had become, against all probability, something she would describe as a friend. He would not have described it that way himself. He would have used more formal language involving mutual professional respect and aligned interests. But he brought her problems he found interesting, and she brought him analyses he could not have reached alone. And on Thursday evenings he sometimes appeared in the library, and they argued about blood law until one of them had to go be somewhere else. And she thought that probably counted. Korvath visited twice. The first visit was formal, court to court, with the full apparatus of ancient protocol. The second visit, 3 years later, was not formal at all. He simply appeared. was given the armchair by the library fire that Nadia had privately designated as his, and spent 4 hours arguing with her about the 16th century woman he had mentioned the first time they met, whose name she had by that point tracked down in his own archived correspondence. She was your friend, Nadia said. She was a considerable irritant, Korvath said. Those things are not mutually exclusive, Nadia said. He looked at her for a long moment. No, he said, I suppose they are not. She and Vladislav were not always easy. They were never simple. Two strong-willed people, each with their own absolute certainties and their own immovable convictions, each completely capable of holding their position across a disagreement for as long as the disagreement required. They were not a smooth-edged partnership. They were a precise-edged one. They met each other exactly as they were, argued when they disagreed, reached conclusions that were genuinely better for having been reached by both of them, and came back to each other after every friction point with the clarity of two people who have chosen this specifically and are not second-guessing the choice. He was still protective. It had not diminished with her transformation. If anything, it had found new registers to operate in, because the things he was protective of now were different, more complex, not her physical safety in the same acute way, but something deeper and more personal. Her time, her judgment. The space she needed to be fully herself, without the weight of court politics pressing in from every direction. He was very good at creating that space, with the particular competence of someone who had been governing complex social environments for 4 centuries, and had precise control of how they operated. She was still direct. It had not softened with time. The 1,000 years she now had ahead of her had not made her more patient with indirect routes to important things. Possibly because she had been raised with the medical training conviction that the fastest path to accurate information was the straightest one. She asked the questions no one else asked. She named the things being carefully not named. She walked into rooms that were supposed to be intimidating and was simply not intimidated, because she had pressed her palm to a cursed altar 6 months into knowing Vladislav and the world had not ended, and she had a fairly calibrated sense by now of what actually warranted fear. The eclipse came around again. It always did. The celestial mechanics of solar eclipses were a matter of orbital calculation, predictable, inevitable, indifferent to what happened beneath them. 3 years after the first one, the cycle brought another total eclipse visible from Paris, and the Valemont court prepared the ritual chamber. This eclipse ritual was different, not because the ritual itself had changed. Blood law was ancient and precise, and not given to modification, but because the witness was different. She was not a human doctor, standing in an underground court, trying to understand a world she had not known existed, holding steady through fear and love in equal measure. She was Nadia Valemont. She had formally taken the name 6 months after her transformation, with the full weight of blood law behind it, which was a more meaningful kind of marriage than anything conducted above ground in the modern world, and she knew every word of the vow, every step of the preparation, every carved symbol on the altar stone. Vladislav stood at the altar. She stood beside him. Sorin was present, and the allied court representatives, and the assembled bloodline, and the eclipse carving was already beginning to illuminate. "Ready?" Vladislav said quietly. Only to her, she looked at the altar. At the silver light beginning to pulse through the obsidian. At the man she had loved for 3 years, who had loved her for longer than he had admitted, who had spent 400 years without this, and was not going to spend any more of whatever came next without it either. "Remind me," she said, "to check the altar stone for compounds before the next one." He looked at her with an expression that was exasperated and deeply, hopelessly fond. "I have had the stone examined by 4 different court scholars, and I replaced the altar entirely after the last time." "Thorough," she said approvingly. "I had good reason to be," he said. "You did," she agreed. She took his hand and turned to face the altar with him. "All right, Lord Valemont, let's finish what we started." The eclipse reached totality. The silver light blazed up through every carved line in the stone. Vladislav spoke the vow in Old Wallachian. For she followed it word by word in her head now. Every syllable perfect, and the seal completed with the same resonant clarity it had found the last time. That single enormous note struck somewhere in the foundation of the world. The sire bond blazed bright through every thread of the bloodline. renewed and unbroken whole. And when it was done, in the moment before the court's response filled the chamber, Vladislav turned to her and looked at her in the blazing silver light with everything he was and everything they had built visible on his face, and said, simply and completely, "Thank you." She knew he did not mean the ritual. He meant all of it. Every piece of the 3 years and the 6 months before them, and the single eclipse night that had begun everything. He meant the altar and the argument, and the hospital corridor and the library, and the decision she had made, and the life they had made, and every moment of every ordinary, extraordinary day they had spent together. She reached up and pressed her hand to his face, the same way she had in the ritual chamber 3 years ago, when he was kneeling on the obsidian floor and she was choosing. He closed his eyes at the contact, exactly the same way he had then. "Don't thank me," she said, "just stay." He opened his eyes, amber, warm, ancient, entirely hers. "For as long as there is such a thing as time," he said, "I will stay." Around them, the court of Valemont moved into celebration, the ancient, formal kind that had its own rules and its own beauty, that she now knew and moved within as naturally as the life she had lived before. The silver light faded slowly from the altar stone, and the chamber filled with the sound of a bloodline intact and held and known, and Vladislav drew her close with the careful, fierce sureness that was simply how he loved her, and she let herself be held and was entirely home.